I'm standing in front of the First Unitarian Church here in historic Louisville, Kentucky. In 1895, this would be the site that Susan B. Anthony chose to deliver a series of speeches in which she helped conduct an organizing tour of the women's rights movement in the South. However, women's rights movement spanned nearly over a century and was a movement that produced many champions and accomplished a lot more than just suffrage in the end. However, looking at the beginning of this movement, we see an overtly Christian theme to the conversation. Protestant theology and principles were a central component within the formative years of the women's rights movement. Its rhetoric and ideas pervaded the moment as a catalyst, a foe, and an ally for women's rights activists. Alexis de Tocqueville said in his 1835 writing Democracy in America, in regards to gender in America, that in no country has such constant care been taken as in America to trace two clearly distinct lines of action for the two sexes and to make them keep pace with the other, but in two pathways that are always different. His musings on gender equality would eventually lead to the historian depiction of what was seen as appropriate spheres of action for women at the time. In Keith Medler's article, he explores these spheres in an article called Ladies Bountiful, Organized Women's Benevolence in the Early 19th Century, showing that early marks of the women's rights movement from the founding of the ladies' church organizations. These organizations dealt mostly with domestic missionary efforts, local preaching and revival meetings, foreign missions, education, and Bible and tract distribution throughout the Sounds. This notion is corroborated in Peggy Brace Siegel's look at moral champions and public pathfinders, antebellum Quaker women in East Central Indiana. Her narrative includes the same findings, that women of the 1830s were involved in mostly public reform as a direct result of growing religious fervor and newly realized leisure that encouraged women to work against social evils of the day. These social evils included slavery, intemperance, prostitution. She asserts that inevitably this led to their conscientiousness of their own enslavement due to their gender. This would be echoed years later by Susan B. Anthony in her speech after her arrest, in which she speaks out against this aristocracy of sex that would be set up. Mark Knoll continues this thought of both of these articles. All three seem to point out to the idea that intense female involvement seemed almost naturally to spill over into growing concern for liberation from the social bondage of women themselves. We see here that the sphere that the church deemed appropriate for women's efforts actually served as a catalyst for their own awakening of realization that they were actually enslaved. Within the early years, we also see outspoken women come forth with an overtly Christian rhetoric. In a series of letters in 1837, Sarah Grimke wrote theological stances on the equality of gender. In one of these letters, she addresses creation and actually uses Genesis 1:26-27, which says, "And God said, let us make man in our own image, after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl in the air, and over the cattle, and over all of the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them." Grimke asserts that in all this sublime description of the creation of man, which is a generic term including man and woman, there is not one particle of difference intimated as existing between them. They were both made in the image of God. Dominion was given both over every other creature, but not over the other. Protestant rhetoric and ideals would fuel the conversation and be a staple in the argument for and against women's rights for years to come. Churches like the one behind me would play an important role in the women's rights movement in the years to come. In 1848, the first women's rights conference was actually held in Seneca Falls, New York, and it was held at a Wesleyan church. Leaders of this convention were none other than Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Both were strong staples of the women's rights movement, and both were also very well versed in Protestant rhetoric. Mott having served as an acknowledged member of the Society of Friends of Quakers, and Stanton having taken a more conventional path through evangelical nurturing to social reform, would both prove to be experts in using Protestant rhetoric for the furthering of their campaign. Miriam Gurko, in her book, The Ladies of Seneca Falls, emphasizes this convention as a starting point for the women's rights movement under a unified banner. During the Seneca Falls Convention, the convention drafted a document called The Sentiments, that reflected what they felt man had done to block or deter women's rights. One of the first sentiments shared actually dealt with the same argument that Grimke had declared in her letters on the creation of man and woman. In the sentiments, it is held that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that are among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This, of course, sounds very familiar as some of the opening lines to the Declaration of Independence. In one section, we see a direct echo of Tocqueville's thoughts from his 1835 writing Democracy in America. He, meaning man, has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself, claiming it as his right to assign for her a sphere of action when that belongs to her conscience and to her God. This was the sentiments that were given by Cady Stanton and others at the Seneca Falls Convention. Stanton and the other contributors believed that it was presumptuous for a man to say what a woman could and could not do, as opposed to allowing her to figure that out with her God. The sentiments once again have this Protestant rhetoric throughout their composition. They even deal with the claims of biblical authority that the opposing forces built their cases on. Another part of the sentiments say he, once more referring to man, allows her in church as well as state, but a subordinate position claiming apostolic authority for her exclusion from the ministry, and, with some exceptions, from every public participation in the affairs of the church. This, of course, was a direct attack on the sentiment of the day. The sentiment can be best seen exhibited by Elder J. Chadwick's statements in 1841. He said that women could tell the story of Calvary and invite sinners to Christ, but not as preachers. Although a seemingly minor issue and still controversial topic today, it was nevertheless a Protestant idea that the convention deemed necessary to cover. While this Protestant rhetoric pervades the sentiments and other written documents surrounding the convention, it continues on past in the inception of women's rights movement and into the foray of the fight. After the Seneca Falls Convention, outspoken women abolitionists and women's rights speakers who were not even in attendance at the convention took note and began to speak whenever and wherever they could. At places like behind me that used to be the Masonic Temple here in Louisville, Kentucky. In 1853, Lucy Stone gave a stirring speech for women's rights on the steps of what is now called City Hall here in Louisville. Many others joined her in this as soon as they heard what had happened in Seneca Falls, including Sojourner Truth, famous African-American who was an abolitionist and women's rights speaker. She gave a short yet long-lived speech at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851. In her remarks, she combats both slavery and gender inequality. But what is interesting to note in her speech is her use of biblical rhetoric and knowledge against a clergyman who just happened to be in the audience. She calls out his belief that women can't have as much rights as men, end quote, because Christ wasn't a woman. She turns the conversation to Christ's conception then. She asks him, "Where did your Christ come from?" She asks him again, "Where did your Christ come from?" From God and a woman, man had nothing to do with him. While simplistic in theology and ideology, it is an interesting example of Protestant rhetoric during the early years of the women's rights movement. The case against women's entitlement to what they considered their inalienable rights can be summed up from a Harper's New Monthly Magazine editor's piece in 1853. The editor says, "There are two antagonists from whom the modern advocates of women's rights find especially in their way. These are the common law and the Apostle Paul." In his rebuking, he centralizes his argument on the Pauline idea that women were not to teach and that the masculine Godhead was represented by the analogy of the church as a bride. This denoted that then the male was to govern while the woman does her duty and waits. This is addressed in Pillars in the Same Temple and Priests in the Same Worship, Women's Rights and Politics of Church and State in Antebellum America, written by Nancy Eisenberg. She states that alliances between the church and state on such issues as male governance contributed significantly to cultural and legal perceptions of women's civil rights status. In Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Elizabeth McClintock's rebuttal to the editor of the Harper's Ferry editorial, they had to defend their meetings from charges of religious and political infidelity. Protestant thought and ideals were a definite force within the early days of the movement. Rhetoric and arguments were based upon biblical evidence, and even the early beginnings of the movement had their roots in the organizations that the church sought to promote. This interconnected web shows the impact of Protestant thought in the early days of the women's rights movement.